So this happened, I think, 15 or so years ago when my grandfather passed away. In my culture, the dead are cremated, and there are elaborate ceremonies performed. The body carried by people while chanting the name of a Hindu god, Ram, after it has been cleaned, clothed, and some ceremonial colors put on it. I was never very close to my grandfather. I barely remember ever having much to talk with him. But my parents say I used to talk to him a lot as a child. Anyway, when he died, I didn't really know much about him other than that he was the patriarch of the family and everybody respected him. I was barely 10 years old then and was supposed to stay at an aunt's house. Sneaky that I was, I managed to follow my mother when she left for my grandfather's house, unaware that I was a few steps behind her. Anyway, the ceremony starts. There's a lot of crying and soon 4 people, including my father, my uncles, and someone I cannot now remember, carry the body on top of a structure made of bamboo and wood. They chant throughout the way. Nobody noticed that I was following them. They reach the cemetery. There's a lot of crying, and I got bored standing at a distance. It's almost dusk and sit weirdly on a nearby platform. I would later come to know that it is sort of a memorial for the deceased. Sometime between all this is happening, I fall asleep. Hours go by, and when I wake up, there is no one. Just the last flames burning through pieces of wood. I panic. I look around to see if there's anyone, but there's no one. I start running towards the pyre, hoping perhaps some of my relatives might spot me by the fire and get hold of me. Again, no one. I start crying. I look around to see if I can find my way to the street. Cemetery was on the outskirts of the town, and it was huge to my tiny mind. Rows after rows of those memorials I mentioned earlier. It's almost dark, and I can hear animals howling at a distance. While all this is happening, I have a creepy feeling that I am being watched. It sends a shiver down my spine, and to this, I don't remember ever being so shit scared. It was such a dark and nauseating feeling, a sense of impending doom. I cry louder and start running. Little did I know that I was running deeper into the cemetery, farther from the road that would take me home. I reach the edge of the open ground and catch my breath near the tree line. I can hear faint voices coming from beyond the silhouette of the trees in front of me. Perhaps someone might be returning after gathering wood from there. I am again hit with this nauseating feeling, and it's stronger now. To top it all, every time I walk or run, it felt like I could hear footsteps, like someone right behind me. I turned around several times, yet found no one. I was so afraid at that point that I thought I might die. I took a leap of faith and ran towards the trees. The sound of footsteps behind me grew louder, and it seemed like whoever it was near, almost at arm's length, like they could just reach out and catch hold of me. I am audibly sobbing and shouting for help. There's barely any light, but I remember hearing people in the distance. Suddenly, I'm in a clearing and see there's a community pond with a bathing area. I can see some people in my family and I ran towards. No matter how loud I tried to cry, there was no sound coming out of my mouth. Finally, an aunt saw me and ran towards me. The last thing I remember before fainting is a hand on my shoulder and my body almost freezing on the spot. I was sick for a week after that, had nightmares for years, and in general, stopped going to my grandfather's house or even the town. To this day, I find it difficult sleeping in the dark and sometimes wake up with a cold sweat and a creepy feeling on my shoulder like someone was holding on. It was about 4 years ago. It wasn't the first paranormal occurrence to happen, just the one that scared me the most. One night, my 2.5-year-old son woke my husband and I up when he crawled into our bed. I couldn't fall back asleep, so I decided to work on a project in my craft room. I was in there for about 45 minutes when the small monitor to the nanny cams started rapidly flickering on and off. Mind you, these were not motion-censored cams, only continuous feed. The cams are in the living room and our son's room. I went over to the monitor and picked it up. It all of a sudden made this loud, ear-piercing sound like a mic feedback. It startled me, and I dropped the monitor face down. I noticed the glow around the edges had stopped flickering. I picked up the monitor and turned to look at the screen. I saw my son standing as still as a statue in the middle of the living room, staring at the wall. I started for the door with the monitor still in my hand. When I glanced down again, my son's head turned, only the head, and his eyes went directly to the camera in the upper corner of the room. He had no expression on his face at all. I left the room and went through the small kitchen and dining room rounded the corner to the living room, and it was empty. The door to our bedroom was on the other side. I went in there and my son was sound asleep in the same position he was in when I left. My husband looked up from his e-reader. I asked him if he had woken up and went to the living. He told me no. I asked if my husband had gotten up to go to the bathroom or kitchen, thinking maybe he just didn't see our son try to follow him. But husband swears he hasn't left the bed at all, and our son has been peacefully snoring away the whole time. Like I said before, this wasn't the first time we had seen doppelgangers, but it was always so brief that you didn't really have time to get scared or have it completely register yet. This was different. It wasn't just a glimpse. Above all, it was the look on my son's face, that empty void stare, when he turned his head to face the camera. Still, even now, typing it gave me the chills. So one of my closest friends growing up lived in a house that was, beyond a reasonable doubt, haunted AF. The house was definitely somewhere around a century old, or at least now it is, and our town was situated in a very woodsy suburb. He and every member of his family had experiences there. Several of our friends had their own experiences there, and I had my own too. Honestly, it would be impossible to try and condense it down into one experience, and I believe it's worth sharing the accounts I can remember. I'll start with the least scary one, which was thankfully my own, and then move to the ones worth telling. During high school, my parents went on a vacation, and for a few days I stayed at this particular house of my friend, let's call him Paul. I stayed in Paul's room in a sleeping bag on the floor while he slept in his bed. One morning, I woke up to someone whispering in my ear, like directly into my ear, "My name, you need to leave." Now, it did not say this super maliciously, almost more of a warning. It definitely woke me up though, and immediately I'm thinking Paul was fucking with me, as he frequently did. But I turned around to my right, where he was sleeping, and realized he was completely out. I said "what?" to him, thinking he was joking around, and he didn't wake up. He was definitely asleep. It was quiet and still too early for even Paul's parents to be up. Then it hit me, as it still hits me today. I heard the whisper in my left ear and Paul was on my right side. Paul had other experiences in that same room, a few I can remember off the top of my head. For a time, he told me he suffered from sleep paralysis on a consistent basis. He would see demons in his room and would be unable to move. He told me that, very frequently in his sleep, the standing fan by his bed would become a demon girl, and he would wake up with a jolt of adrenaline, having punched or thrown the fan down to the ground. He told me he would sometimes see someone standing in the closet his bed faced, both asleep and awake. Oddly enough, his sleep paralysis significantly decreased as soon as he moved out of that place. That floor, the second floor where Paul, his parents, and 2 of his 4 sisters slept, was spooky. I remember getting weird feelings up there. One of his sisters claimed to see the ghost of a little boy in their bathroom. His mom once opened the closet in her bedroom to find the same little boy standing in there, looking up at her and asking for his mom. I heard about that one when I was in middle school, and it always creeped me out. It's always scarier when the adults see them too. Before my own experience, I generally thought Paul was just trying to fuck with me when he would tell me about these other experiences. Most of our other friends were the same way, thinking Paul was full of shit. Even after my own experience, at times I thought I just as easily could have dreamt it up. But then a few of those same friends, some of them complete non-believers beforehand, had their own experiences, and that changed my whole idea of the house. Once a year, Paul and his family would take a trip and have someone take care of their 2 dogs. One of our mutual friends came over to do just that one day. When she got there that evening to feed the dogs, the house was dark and empty. For some context, the dogs were being fed near the kitchen, and adjacent to the kitchen was the dining room, which led further away into the entryway, and after that, a small living room. Well, not long after feeding the dogs, she heard a blood-curdling scream, a goddamn shriek, coming from that living room, like someone was inside with her. She booked it outside with the dogs, checked for intruders, and saw no one was there. I'm pretty sure after that, she called Paul, told him what happened, and he laughed and said, "Yeah, shit like that happens sometimes." A couple years later, one of the bigger doubters in our group, who thought all of us were full of shit, had his own experience. Paul hosted a fair amount of parties back then, and usually we would use his basement to avoid any sort of noise complaints. So all of us are in the basement having a good time, and this particular friend of ours decides to run up and grab another drink from upstairs. Mind you, this friend is not the kind of guy to get completely fucked up, like he'll only ever have a beer or two at most. So for all intents and purposes, he's sober. He goes up and the ground floor was completely empty as everyone is in the basement. There was a porch directly outside the dining room, entryway, living room, and it extended long ways across the back of the house. As our friend was walking into the dining room to grab a beer off the table, he sees a tall, grim-looking woman standing on the porch outside, looking through the window directly at him. He knows something is wrong because she's sort of featureless and also standing outside by herself looking inside. He takes his eyes off her one moment, looks back, and she's gone. A few days later, he tells Paul what happened, and Paul tells him how he and his siblings have seen that same woman before. Our friend becomes a believer. The basement was creepy as hell, but I can only think of one thing that ever happened down there. It was more of a storage cellar than anything. We still used it for parties and just generally hanging out, but it was so cluttered with random shit that whole areas of the room were completely cut off. At some point in college, one summer when I was back home, Paul and his family were doing the annual Throw Old Shit Away Fest, and he openly invited some friends to come help. I came one day, and when I got there, Paul's dad nonchalantly told me, "You get to see the secret room." Turns out that in the far corner of the basement, behind a bunch of clutter, was a little storage closet nobody, besides maybe Paul's parents, knew about. We investigated it that day, and in it we found a bunch of random old shit. I can't remember everything exactly. I don't even know if Paul's family knew what this stuff was, but among all of it, I specifically remember finding this very old-fashioned vintage music box. You know, like the one in The Conjuring with the dancing ballerina, that kind of thing. We decided it was creepy and didn't want anything to do with it and left it in that closet. Well, on a different day, when I thankfully was not there, Paul and another friend were cleaning out the basement when suddenly that same music box started playing by itself from behind the door of the closet. They were alone and had not been in that closet all day. They bolted up the stairs. At the top of the house, there were 2 small bedrooms, both belonging to Paul's older sisters. This is the last one I will share, as it's the story that stuck with me the longest. The second oldest sister once had a vivid and intense dream in which she herself was being exorcised. A demon was being forced out of her as a group of priests were standing over her convulsing body, shouting verse at her, and she remembered it just being crazy intense. After enduring this for some time, she suddenly jolts herself awake and yells, and at that precise moment, a rosary she kept hanging on her wall flies from its place, crashes to the floor, and shatters into a bunch of pieces. Completely on its own, she was covered in sweat and completely terrified. No one else was in the room. Yeah, that place was fucking haunted.